Hello everyone, I'm Zach Peterson and I'd like to welcome you all to another Flux tutorial, and today we're going to be going over the version control system in Flux. Now, if you're a hardware developer and you're working as part of a larger team, or if you have any experience with firmware or software, you're probably familiar with version control systems. For those of you that aren't familiar with version control systems, this tutorial should help you out. So we're going to look at how version control works in Flux and what exactly you can do with it, and just what is a version control system. What is a version control system? Well, version control systems do exactly as their name suggests. They are used to control which version of a project you are currently working on. And version control systems were originally invented in the context of software, but you can technically use them for any set of data that multiple people might be working on and modifying. So a version control system has some operations that are built into it, and so I think it's best to kind of look at this in terms of a simple example. Let's just say that I have a repository with project data. I'm going to draw it out with this blue box. And this project data could have a history of different versions. So just for example, when the project is first created, it started as version 1. Later it gets modified to version 2. Someone else might modify it to version 3, and so on and so forth. Now, this data can be accessed and modified, and then as it's modified, maybe we eventually get to, let's say, version 14 or version 15, and so on and so forth. So essentially what the version control system is doing is it is tracking who has made changes to a project and then what those changes are. And so at any time you could say enter at version 15 and then roll it back to version 14 or an earlier version. Or if you wanted to, you could roll it all the way back to the first version. Now, there are a couple of important operations that we've discussed in another video, and two of the main operations that I'll show conceptually are forking and cloning. So let's just say that I want to take some of this data in this project and I want to duplicate it and make that into a new project. Well, the simplest way to do this is to either fork it or clone it. So let's just say that I start with version 15 and I make a copy of it and I make a new version 15. I'm going to draw this arrow here, and let's say we started with version 15, we now have a new version 15. So if I fork this version 15 into a new project, this new set of data starts at version 15. But with forking, I maintain a link to all of the other versions. So if I want, I could roll this back to version 14 or version 10 or any of the other previous versions all the way back to version 1. So that's essentially what forking is. Now, cloning is an alternative way to do this. So cloning essentially starts with version 15 and then it makes its own new version 15 as a totally separate project. However, I now cannot roll back this cloned version 15 to an earlier version. So version 15 starts as its own project, and then later I just start editing this and then it goes to version 16 and so on and so forth. So forking and cloning are two of the fundamental operations within Flux, as well as tracking all of these earlier versions that exist within a project, both in the original project as well as in the forked or the cloned project. So you can access this inside the editor when you're working on a project in Flux. So I think the next question that is logical to ask is, how do we access and use the version control system in Flux? How do we get data into and out of the version control system in Flux? Well, the first thing to note is that the version control system is always running in the background. So it's kind of like Google Docs. So if you've ever used Google Docs and you type something on the screen, it actually has a version control system built into it that's always running in the background, and it will just save all of your data into a new version. So Flux works basically in the same way. So let's just say I open up one of these projects. If I go in here to this project, what I can do is, you'll notice here up in the upper left corner, it says loaded right here. And if I take this and I make some change to this project, like let's say I move this around, you see for a moment it says saving right here. What it's doing is it's saving that change in this data to a new version of this project. Now, to see all of the previous versions of this project and to see all of the changes that have been made, I can just go up here to the main menu, and then I can go down here to change history. And now you can see all of these different changes that have happened to the project over the past. So I can roll back to any of these changes in this history list, and that will revert the project to one of these earlier versions. So all I do is, again, just go and I access this from the main menu. Any new data that I want to add into the version control system, again, it all happens automatically. So it's not like you would have to do with Git, where you may have to do it from a console, write out a command, and then tell the version control system which data it's supposed to accept. The Flux platform handles all of this for you, so you don't have to do any of that extra work inside of a console or configure any kind of version control system on your own, and you don't have to use a third-party system. I mentioned earlier that there are two important operations that we perform in version control systems. Two of them are forking and cloning. Now, other version control systems have other commands that you could execute as far as pulling and committing data to the system, but the two main ones that you use in Flux are forking and cloning. And so you can access this again from the main menu. So when I'm in my own project, you can see here I have an option to clone the project. And so if I were to clone this project, it would make a copy of it starting from the current version, and that cloned project would be a totally new project, and I won't be able to roll that new project back to one of the versions that is in this list. Now, if I fork a project, you'll notice here that I'm actually not able to fork one of my own projects, but what I can do is if I find something in the library and I want to fork that, I can actually do that, and then I'll be able to edit that forked project as a new project which I control. So let's just say, for example, I open up U2 and I open up this component. So let's take a look at this. So what I can do is, once I'm in this component, you'll notice here that I have an option right here to fork it. Or I could go into the main menu and I can click fork here. So that's how I would access the forking feature for this particular project. Now, the other thing about the version control system is if the part that I want to fork or clone is publicly available, what I can do is I can actually see the change history for everything in this part. And what it's doing is it's showing me all of the previous changes to the data in this particular part, as well as who made the changes and then what the change was. And I can scroll back through this entire history. And if I want, I could make a fork of this and roll back to one of these earlier versions, or just as an example, I can inspect one of these earlier versions if I really need to and decide whether or not I want to actually take advantage of one of these earlier versions of this part as my own forked project. So the version control system is really important in Flux because it allows you to keep track of all of those changes. And then you'll also notice here, just like in the publicly available project, if I open up my own project, it tracks the same data. So it's tracking the version list, it's also tracking who made changes and then what those changes were. Let's just say that I want to restore one of these older versions of this project and I want to say undo some of these changes. Well, that's pretty simple. I would just select this earlier version and then click restore version, and then you'll see here up at the very top that it says I reverted the document to version, and then you have a version number here. So this tells you again what happened inside of the project, and it even tracks reversions to earlier versions of this project. Now, so far I've just been working in the schematic and I've been working with parts, but I could also make changes in the PCB layout, and if I make any of those changes, those will also be tracked in the version control system. So let's just say, as an example, maybe I move this trace around, or I just delete this trace, whatever the case may be. Maybe I change some of the routing on this. That is also going to be tracked inside of the version control system, and you can tell it's being tracked again because you see here, as soon as I made that little change, it saved it. And then of course, when I'm inside the PCB editor, I can go up here to change history, and if I want to, I could just revert this back to that earlier version if I need to. Now, the other thing to note is that the data tracking is also not just limited to the PCB layout, but if I edit any code here, if I'm inside the code editor, let's just say I write in some test code, you'll see here that it also saves that data into the version control system. Again, you go up to change history, take a look, you'll see that I updated the simulation code. Now, of course, I'm going to delete this because this is bogus test code, but you get the idea. As soon as I make those changes, it all gets committed to the version control system, and you just saw it update live. Now, there's one other set of data that we can also make changes to or update and add into the version control system. Now, of course, there's everything here on the right side of the screen. Of course, anything that we do here in the objects section, but also you'll notice here that updates are available for parts. So if I go in and review these and I start accepting them, those changes will also get added in to the version control system. So that, in a nutshell, is how the version control system in Flux works. Now, two of the operations that I mentioned, forking and cloning, I think those can be a bit confusing for folks who have never used version control system in the past. So what I've done is I've prepared another video that focuses specifically on those two operations. So there's a link to that video in the description. I encourage you to go watch that video to learn more, and you can follow along in Flux with that tutorial. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.